How's it going? My name is Brian Park. I am the chapter director of DC. Anybody from DC? All right, my peeps. DC is not very popular these days for unobvious reasons, but our next speaker is very popular. He is the CEO and co-founder of DraftKings. DraftKings is a skill-based daily fantasy sports platform where users can win hundreds of thousands of dollars, and maybe possibly millions. So he's going to, the company actually raised close to $600 million, and he's going to be interviewed by senior editor from Recode, Kurt Wagner. So let's give it up. Hands for Jason Robbins and Kurt Wagner.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're going to talk today about fantasy sports, specifically daily fantasy sports. And actually, I have a bunch of questions. Jason and I have known each other for a couple years now, so this is not our first time chatting. But I find it somewhat helpful to explain what daily fantasy sports are, because I think if you're a diehard sports fan, you probably know, but to me, I don't know if it's quite mainstream yet. What do you think? Can you give us a quick explanation?
Yeah, absolutely. So fantasy sports have been around for a long time. As probably most of you know, fantasy sports is a game where you get together, whether with a group of friends or just a bunch of other people that you meet online that really like sports, and you do a draft where you pick a team of real-world players, and that team is comprised of players from all the different real sports teams. And then you compete over the course of a season by having those players that you picked go up in matchups against players that someone else picked, and their stats translate into fantasy points. And those fantasy points are the scoring mechanism to see who put together the better team, who was the better general manager. Daily fantasy sports is the latest version of this game, and the key difference is that instead of playing over the course of an entire season, you play for one day, or in the case of NFL or golf, for one weekend. So very similar, almost identical in every other way that I mentioned, but just a shorter duration. And a lot of what we've been able to do is to create a lot of interest in different types of sports that weren't as conducive to the sort of season-long thing, because maybe they were more driven by things like, so golf, for example, a lot of people pay attention during the majors, but they're not necessarily as into golf that they want to play every single week. But they try it out with us, like, sure, I'll try it for a weekend and see how it is during the Masters or the US Open, and they love it, and then they end up playing a lot more.
Right, so you're taking real-world results and you're converting them into fantasy points, right? And you and I might go head-to-head, and obviously that's been really popular. I mean, you guys have raised hundreds of millions in funding. You have partners. Pretty much all of the major sports leagues, with the exception of the NFL, are like formal partners. Before we get into a lot of that, I do want to talk a little bit about your business, because you guys, just before the holidays, you announced you were merging with Vanduul, which was pretty much like an arch rival for a long time. Walk me through, I guess, how's that merger going right now? It's been a couple months since you announced it, so is it final? Is it getting close to final? And what made you want to merge with your arch nemesis, or what used to be your arch nemesis, now your best friend, right?
Well, I never quite viewed them as an arch nemesis. I mean, certainly, like any competitor in the marketplace, you want to be the best, and you always kind of look at the other beacon companies that are doing great things and are innovating and are driving growth, and Vanduul was clearly that company. And so for us, they for many years were something that we looked at as a model for what we wanted to achieve. They were around before us. They really built a lot of the initial framework for the daily fantasy games, and so for us, it was really about trying to do what they were doing, but do it even better. And as other entrants came into the market, Yahoo and CBS was in for a little while, and other kinds of companies, it kind of made sense to say, look, we're startups. We're never going to be able to compete long term with these bigger media companies. And if you look back at actual traditional fantasy sports, which I mentioned have been around for decades, when they first hit the internet, it was initially driven by a bunch of startups. There were companies like Commissioner.com and My Fantasy League. lots of these startups that came and really were the initial pioneers of internet-based fantasy sports, which changed everything because back in the day, fantasy sports couldn't be nearly as popular as it required people to compute by hand how all these stats
sitting at the table.
Get out the newspaper box score every day, and people were calling in or faxing results. So when the internet came, all these startups came and started it. But what happened over the course of the next several years is basically the big media companies took it over. So now people don't really think of my fantasy leagues. They think of CBS or NFL.com or the biggest two, ESPN and Yahoo. They really took over the market. So as we saw Yahoo make their entrance and heard rumors of ESPN and others coming in, we said, look, we don't want to have the same fate. While we're sitting here beating each other's brains in, all these other big media companies are coming to just make history repeating itself again. And also we have bigger and broader ambitions. A lot of what we've been doing recently to make a foray into content, into other types of fantasy sports games, those are things that would be hard, that would be less possible with a resource-constrained environment. And what excites me most about the merger is that instead of putting resources towards overhead and things that really, a lot of legal bills lately, for example, we can pool all that into one, and we can reinvest a lot of those dollars into better product and better experiences for the consumer. I feel like we haven't done as good a job as we need to there, especially over the last year and a half or so. And this is really going to allow us to put a better product and a better experience out there. And at the end of the day, that's what makes people make decisions. It's not, are you a big media company? It's do you put the best product out there?
So incumbents, or I guess not incumbents, but bigger players coming in, you realize, all right, we kind of need to team up or we could be in trouble here. For other entrepreneurs that are here, they often go through they'll get an offer from a bigger player or maybe a similar merger opportunity. At what point, folks like me had been saying, why don't you guys merge for like 2 years? We were like, you guys are just spending a bunch of money competing against each other. What took so long? So what was the tipping point for you to finally say, it's better for us to do it this way versus trying to go alone? Like, was there one moment?
Well, you're quite prescient, and I have also, myself felt for probably the last couple years that it's something interesting to explore. I know when you and I first met, we even talked about this.
Right.
So it was always something I was interested in, but there was never this kind of driving force until about a little over a year ago when we started to have a lot of regulatory pressure, and that just created a ton of incremental costs. It also made it so that we realized we're actually trying to do the same thing here. We started working together very closely. Before we hadn't done that. We started pooling resources for lobbying and other sorts of efforts in that area, and we felt it was important to come up with a common regulatory framework.
Sorry, for those who are wondering, the regulatory stuff being, so a lot of this is you pay to compete, and someone wins and wins the money, right? And to some people this is gambling, to others this is a game of skill. You guys obviously have said it's a game of skill. So just, I guess, for background, those are the legal battles you were dealing with in all the different states, right? Because everyone handles their gambling laws differently.
Yeah, so what happened was a lot of states started passing laws that not only created more requirements for the companies, which means we need to invest in compliance departments and in other sorts of overhead that would make it so that we could operate legally in those states, but also taxes. New York, for example, passed a 15% revenue tax, which is a lot of your revenue to be going just straight to the tax man. So that really caused, along with a lot of legal bills, a number of additional costs for us. But the real thing that this experience did is it just caused us to spend more time together. As we started working together and realizing, hey, we're trying to really build the same big vision here. We're trying to accomplish the same thing. It's like anything. You spend time with somebody that you didn't know very well, and you get to know them better, and a lot of these conversations just develop organically. And so, something that was an interesting idea before, but just never kind of came together.
Yeah.
I remember Nigel's the Vanduul CEO. We were in Albany quite a bit, which is the capital of New York, and nothing against the good people of Albany, but not a place with a whole lot of things to do. So he and I would go out to dinner or drinks, and we just started talking about this stuff, and it kind of came together organically.
Gotcha. Okay, so you guys are coming together. It's not done yet.
Not done yet.
But end of this year or hopefully?
Oh, I hope much sooner than that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back a little bit to normal startup stuff like funding. Like you guys have raised, I believe it was almost 600 million, and that doesn't include what Vanduul raised, right? Which was multiple hundreds of millions of dollars as well. So when you started taking those checks, what was that like, right? I mean, this is your first time entrepreneur.
Yeah, first
so
time.
all of a sudden, over time, but you're cashing, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of VC money. Does that come with a lot of pressure? What was kind of going through your mind when you were going through this process?
Well, it started our very first funding round, which was actually everybody asked me what was the hardest to raise. It was not the hundreds of millions. It was the very first one. I must have been said no to by somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 different individuals and firms. It was just one no after the other. And finally, we scrapped together 1.4 million in seed funding. So that was the toughest experience by far. And I think for any first-time entrepreneur, once you've had a successful venture, it's not that hard to raise your seed round. Actually, future rounds become harder. As a first-time entrepreneur, the seed round is extraordinarily difficult. And then, kind of built from there. Our next round was about 8 or 9 million. Then we raised 24. So it kind of built up. And as for the pressure, we've been very fortunate that we've had just an unbelievable group of investors who've been very supportive. Certainly, they want to see us succeed and they want to see us deliver returns.
Yeah.
But they get that what we're building here is something that it's not about next year or the year after. It's a medium to longer term thing for them. And I think a lot of what's allowed us to be successful is that we've been fortunate to have a great group of investors and a great board that's been really influential, and also just has allowed us to kind of do our own thing and figure it out ourselves.
So a number of your investors are strategic, right? They're owners of sports teams. They're sports teams themselves. They're at the actual leagues. The takeaway for someone on the outside is it seems obvious, right? I mean, if people are playing fantasy baseball, they're probably going to watch more baseball, and therefore MLB is saying, score, we want you to succeed because if you succeed, we get more people tuning into our product. Is it as simple as that? Like, what do these, strategic investors provide to you that maybe a traditional venture capitalist doesn't?
Well, I think it is pretty much as simple as that. It's great for their sport. When people play our games, they consume more sports content. A lot of them will start to follow new sports. So almost half of our customers say that they started following and paying attention to a new sport that they never followed before playing on DraftKings. Because they like the product, they try it out perhaps for NFL, and then they're, this is pretty fun, I'll try hockey or basketball or baseball, and they love that too, and then they, of course, start paying attention to it. So it really is as simple as that. I'd say the other factors, though, are that these are all business people, and if they see something that they think can grow and can be built into a big business, then just like the venture investors, they want to invest in it for the same reasons.
Right. I know that there was a time like, we can talk about the ESPN thing, right? ESPN was going to invest, and then they got cold feet because of the regulatory stuff. Are people pretty much past that at this point? Are most of your investors comfortable with where you guys are from a regulatory standpoint?
Well, I think for the most part, the most challenging period is done. We do still have some work to do. We had 10 different states so far that have passed regulatory frameworks that in some cases have fees and taxes, of course, as well. But we want to ultimately get everywhere, all 50 states to have coverage, because it's really not about comfort in terms of legality. We always felt good there. It's more that this is a business that as it got bigger and as it became more on people's radar, it needed to be regulated. At first, I think that was a scary thought to us, but as we've gotten to understand the way that process works, we've embraced it. So our thinking is that as many places regulated are as many places that feel comfortable with the way that we're operating, and even if we do think that we're fine from a legal standpoint, it just is going to make sense to have regulations in place.
Okay. We talked a little bit about why some of these folks may want to invest in you. How is that actually going in terms of the idea of someone playing Major League Baseball, daily fantasy, and then tuning into more games? Like, have you guys been able to actually prove that out and say, hey, our users watch X number of hours more than the typical baseball fan or something? Does it actually equate that way?
Yeah, almost. Well, we've done a number of research studies on this, and really any way you slice it, the metrics all line up to what you're saying. So I mentioned earlier, almost half our customers start paying attention to new sport. Almost 80% report that they consume more sports content. On average, they say they consume about 40% more content, and these are already many of the avid fans. So this is coming from a pretty high baseline. So really, any way you look at the survey and research data, it lines up that way. But this isn't a new concept. This has been something that since the traditional fantasy sports game has been around, that's been known. And that's why you've seen the NFL and other sports leagues invest and integrate so much of fantasy into what they do. The Red Zone channel essentially was invented for fantasy customers. At least I don't know who would be watching that besides fantasy customers, and they get millions of viewers every year. I can tell you from a personal standpoint, because I was a huge fantasy sports fan before, I still am, but I played many years before I started DraftKings. I never would have paid attention to the degree I do. I mean, I followed my favorite teams and maybe a few other teams in their division, but did I know the backup running back of the Jacksonville Jaguars? No. So it's caused me to consume a lot more sports content. Anyone who's played, they get it. They've experienced it. It's sort of self-evident.
Gotcha. So how many people are actually doing this these days? And 2 years ago was kind of, 2015 football season, I feel like, was your coming out party, right? Like, you guys had just raised a bunch of money. Anyone who watched a football game that year probably saw one of your commercials. You were spending hundreds of millions on TV advertising. You toned back this past football season on the TV stuff. Did you see the same number of users year over year? Like, what is the user base like?
So, when you spend a lot less on marketing, not surprisingly, you don't grow as quickly. So we still had a very nice growth year. We posted excellent numbers, but it wasn't at the same level as when we were spending in 2015. But, that came with some consequences too, beyond some of the regulatory stuff we talked about. I think we had a little burnout. We had a lot of people say that they were sick of seeing the commercials over and over again. And we're always thinking about the long game. So for us, the goal is not just to maximize every number at long-term expense. It's to make sure that we're building a healthy brand. So that was part of the thinking really this year. As far as the overall numbers that you asked about, there's about 57 million people that play fantasy sports of some kind. Right now, we have about 7 million total registrants and about 3 million that are paying customers for us. So we still have a long way to go. I mean, we are nowhere near where we think the market is. And fortunately, I think that can be even bigger because that's been growing. When we started the business, it was only about 30-something million, and now it's up to 57.
Wow. Okay.
And that's just in North America. That doesn't even include global numbers.
Right. Okay, so you guys have 3 million paying customers, and what is the most, I always kind of associate fantasy with the NFL. You mentioned the Red Zone channel. For those that don't know, that's basically just shows scoring plays, right? The plays that kind of impact a fantasy outcome. So there's a whole TV show or network, I guess, around fantasy, if you will. So I associate the games with NFL. What's the biggest sport for you guys? Is the NFL head and shoulders above everyone else? Are there other sports that are really, I guess, money makers for you at the moment?
Well, we think that a lot of the sports that maybe traditionally weren't as popular because the season-long version of the game wasn't as conducive to it. So NFL, even the season-long version, it's essentially a series of head-to-head weekly or daily matchups. So it's kind of almost a hybrid of the two. Other sports didn't translate that well from season-long into it, so I think that daily, or the version of the game that we offer, can actually create a lot more growth. As far as your question, NFL is still the biggest. I mean, in part, that's because they have the largest fan base in North America. It just is so much bigger than anybody else. But the other big ones are baseball, basketball. Those are huge for us. And then I tell people this, and they're somewhat surprised. One of the ones that's been the fastest growing and the most popular is golf. Golf has done tremendously well. We recently launched NASCAR. That's been doing very, very well. So these are some examples of sports that maybe didn't translate that well to a season-long game, but are perfect for our version.
Gotcha. When you guys look at the future of media here, we talked about your ad spending, we're talking about TV and potentially driving more tune-in to actual games. Does it matter to you where people are consuming? Like, I cover Twitter, for example, for Recode, and Twitter streams some Thursday night NFL games this year, right? And there was a story out yesterday that Facebook wants to stream some baseball games. And Does it matter to you where people are tuning in? Do you have any interest? I know those rights are obviously very expensive. I assume you probably would never, I shouldn't say never, but right now couldn't afford them yourselves. But how do you kind of see the future of sports consumption? Does that impact what you guys do?
Oh, I think it's very important. So what's interesting is that the whole media universe, and especially the way people are consuming sports, is changing. So on the positive side, a ton of traction is being built in just the arena of sports, because in an on-demand world, the thing that people still want to watch live and just will always probably want to be watched live are sports. So you're seeing a tremendous amount of investment coming in. That's good for us, because more access to viewing games, regardless of whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or on TV, anywhere, just more places and more games that people can view. That means that they're going to be more interested in what we do, because half of the fun of playing is to be able to actually watch the games. If you can't watch the games, it's not as fun. So we love that. We think that that's a really great trend, and our hope is certainly probably in the short term not to go out and compete in bidding on those media rights, but what we would like to do is integrate some of that into our platform. We think we can drive viewership and engagement for the companies that are bidding on those media rights by having some kind of integration to our platform, since we not only have the overall base of customers that want to watch, we can target incredibly well. We know today not only what sport you want to watch, but based on the players you pick for your team, which games you're going to want to watch. In golf, we know which golfers you're going to want to follow. That kind of targeting capability means that all these rights that are being invested in by all these other companies, we can deliver customers very, very effectively. It's almost the same thing Facebook does for advertisers, where they say we have so much data on people, so we can target very specifically based on interests. Well, we have the same kind of data in the sports world. We know what games, what players you're going to want to follow. So we think there's a role for us to play there.
What do you do with that data now? Anything?
Not really. I mean, right now we're really focusing more on our own game and our own product. We have started to create content recently, so that's been useful. We just launched a product called DK Live.
That's an app. That's its own app, right?
It's its own app. It's for live scoring and news. But we haven't really. So what we've been doing, we focus very much on foundational capabilities. So when we thought about the social aspects of the game, we said, what do people need to do first? They need to be able to form groups of friends. We need to know who wants to play with who. So we did things like implement Facebook Connect. We created a product called Leagues that allow people to form groupings of people they want to play with. So the way that we're thinking about data right now is how do we get, because we have so much data, right? And sometimes there's a downside to that you're overwhelmed by, you don't know what to do with it. Right. So we said, all right, how do we think about building a foundational capability here? And for us, that's focusing mostly around organizing the data and figuring out if we were to use it for some of the purposes I mentioned down the road, how would we need it stored? How do we need to curate things with it? So that's really what we've been focusing on now.
So right now you're making money because if you and I are in a competition, you would take a cut of whatever money we pool together before we distribute it to the winner, right? Do you advertise, or do you sell advertising right now?
We definitely advertise.
You advertise. Are people advertising on DraftKings?
We just recently started that. So this past NFL season was our first foray into it. We had some very limited focus there because we were sort of getting our feet wet, but it was tremendously successful. And what's cool about that is we're able to take some of those ad dollars and reinvest in things for the consumer. So an example is we ran this big free game with $100,000 in prizes sponsored by Jack Reacher. Paramount Pictures was the sponsor there. And by having them put in ad and sponsorship dollars, we can both promote their product, but also we can deliver something of value to the consumer, which is good for us, but it's also good for the advertiser, because the advertiser now associates them with, this is the reason I get to play this big free game, is because this sponsor stepped up and spent some money on it. So we think that there's a real connection that can be made there. We would like to, down the road, integrate pricing that's not just dollars, but merchandise and other sorts of things that can create a more deeper connection. And we have such an engaged customer and such a unique customer that we absolutely believe it will be very valuable to advertisers.
So we got a few more minutes here. What's the future look like for DraftKings Vanduul after you combine? First of all, do you have a name, by the way?
Not yet. Everybody asks me that, but we're still working on it.
I mean, do you see this as a big enough business to be a publicly traded company someday? Do you think that an ESPN or a CBS or a Yahoo or someone comes in and you join a bigger player? Like, what are your ambitions here?
Well, our goal is to compete with those companies, so we're really focused on our own path. I do think this is a public company. I think that this is a company that can be built into tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars worth of market cap and value. And see you smirking a little bit there? No, I'm kidding. I absolutely think so.
Let you do your pitch right now.
All right, I'll do my pitch.
This is great.
I think that where we sit is at this tremendous intersection of both positive trends in the world of games and gaming, and you see it everywhere from esports to fantasy games. There's just all this focus now, and sports in particular within games has become such a focus, and also this amazing place on the media front. So you talked earlier about how all these digital-first companies, mobile-first companies are getting into streaming, and sports is getting so much attention as you see, even on the older channels like radio, talk radio that used to be politically focused, those stations are converting over to sports. So we're at this tremendous intersection of these incredibly positive trends on the gaming front and on the media front. So we really love where we sit, and we're gonna have to execute well. We're gonna have to make sure that we figure out what our role to play is in that. But we think there's a lot of runway left and a lot of value to be created.
So you want to be a publicly traded company someday?
Someday.
As a sports fan, to wrap things up, as a sports fan, TV aside, where do you like to watch games? I mean, would you pay Amazon Prime to watch football? Would you pay HBO or Netflix or someone? Who's going to ultimately be our sports provider?
I don't know exactly who, but I think the kind of companies that you mentioned, the answer is absolutely. For people who are in the younger generation, and I think Time is on the side of wanting to cater to those folks, they're really device agnostic. They're channel or medium agnostic, I should say. Yes, if I'm home, I might want to sit in front of my TV, but if I'm out, I want to be able to watch on my mobile phone. If I'm traveling on the road and I want to boot up my laptop in the airport, which I'm heading to after this, I want to be able to watch there. So I would subscribe to different types of places to be able to access sports content anywhere I went, and I think that's absolutely where the world is going.
Would you watch on Snapchat?
I would.
Snapchat, awesome. Jason, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.